Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fueling Creativity in Education podcast, and welcome to our continued exciting start to Season 10, which is a collection of episodes dedicated to exploring diversity topics within gifted and talented education.
These episodes were recorded on location at the 2024 National Association for Gifted and Talented Conference in Seattle, Washington, which is what makes them extra special.
Now, in the second episode of this mini-series, we sat down with Dr. Austina De Bonte, who is a consultant, speaker, coach, and advocate for gifted and twice exceptional students with the company Smart is Not Easy.
Dr. De Bonte is also president of the Washington Coalition for Gifted Education and speaks regularly at regional and national conferences, and works closely with schools and individual families to support their needs in gifted education and twice exceptional learners.
So let's begin.
So, Austina, thank you so much for joining us today. So we want to start with your background because this is not your first career. This is your second career. So can you tell us a little bit about your first career in tech and how you ended up in gifted education?
Well, I think I ended up in gifted education the way a lot of people end up in gifted education. You have really complex kids. You need to figure them out. And the more you learn, the more you realize there is to learn. And how I kind of grew into gifted ed was really in realizing that once I kind of had gotten a grip on what was happening with my kids, I had uncovered so much interesting things that I knew other people needed. But, my first career was in technology. My first degree was in computer science. I have a master's degree and a bachelor's degree from MIT. Worked at Microsoft for many years, 17, I think. And that was a really great spot for me. Like I learned a lot about how to work in organizations. I did a lot of leadership development work there. I ended up building a whole training program for engineers on how to think creatively, how to do sort of creative thinking in the context of an engineering workforce, which is an interesting problem because you're explaining something that to some people is intuitive, but for that community largely is not intuitive. So how do you kind of science-ify customer focus and, sort of creative approaches, design thinking, if you will. So anyway, I spent a bunch of time at Microsoft doing that work and leading teams through understanding how to become more customer focused, which involved a lot of leadership development, et cetera. But over time, I spent more and more of my time in gifted education, kind of in the nonprofit world here in Washington State. So I was the president of the Northwest Gifted Child Association for almost 10 years. More recently, I still serve on that board, but no longer as president. Now I serve as president of the Washington Coalition for Gifted Education. That is our legislative advocacy group. So we actually have 3 organizations here in Washington. There's a teacher group, a parent group, and a legislative advocacy group. So I've been part of these 2. So anyway, that gives you kind of a sense as to who I am and where I've been. But as I've done more and more nonprofit work, and have really had to dig into the research on, the things that we're working on with the nonprofits. Eventually, a buddy of mine kind of pulled me into a graduate program, and so I just finished my doctoral degree.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, congrats. I do want to follow up on your work in Washington State, because one of the things that I'm starting to become more aware of is the challenge of implementing gifted ed programs, because we've been discussing schools, districts, have priorities, but not all of them are the same. And gifted ed is probably something that you have to prioritize if you are to make a success of it, particularly when it comes to addressing equity issues in education. So speaking with your experience, and I'm just curious to know whether or not you've been able to leverage some of your previous career to assist you. Imagine I'm coming from a state and we have no gifted ed program, and I'm trying to raise more awareness in schools and school districts and work toward a systematic program that can be implemented statewide, or at least form some unity within the state. What are some of the things that I should be thinking about? Where might I start? And again, how have you leveraged your previous career to support you in doing some of that work?
And how much time do we have? That's like a 4-hour question.
Well, do you know where it's coming from? I'm not sure. I'm curious to know how many people have, because it's interesting because you have the parent, with the parent, there's lots of different elements that have to come together, particularly when it comes to developing legislation, which obviously is very important when it comes to actually mandating, I suppose, a program across the state.
But, there's legislation, and there's actually getting buy-in of people to actually do the legislation, right? I mean, I just came from an affiliate meeting where everybody was complaining about how, we've got these laws, but the districts aren't actually doing it. Right. And Washington is no different. We have some districts that are doing a great job and others that aren't. We're lucky in Washington in that we have pretty strong law base. We've had mandatory, what we call highly capable programs. That is our Washington state for gifted education. We call it HICAP for short. That has existed in Washington since 2014. So we're on a decade now. Required in grades K-12, required for districts to identify, required for districts to serve. It's a lot of room for local control in terms of how districts actually do that, but they are required to do something, and they're required to report back to the state on, what they are doing. So there's a lot of important pieces. But the thing that we've really been working on over the past number of years, about 5-ish now, is equitable identification and equity in practices. I mean, and there's so many different flavors of equity. Like equitable identification is easy to talk about, and I spent a ton of time there. But also equity and quality of services is a whole nother ball of wax, right? And, and there's a big piece of that in getting educators on board, right, with what needs to happen. Like the law says this, but are you actually doing it? And are you doing it sort of in a way where you really understand why you're doing it and you care and you're doing it with reason, or are you just kind of checking the box?
But I do know that, congratulations, you just finished your dissertation, that in your dissertation, you looked at equitable identification methods. So can you tell us a little bit about what you did in your research and what you discovered?
Sure. So my dissertation was a pretty detailed case study of a school district here in Washington state, in a suburban school district, where they had invested in equitable identification for about 6 or 7 years, and ongoing, but I was able to sort of capture that time period. I did a whole lot of interviews of administrators, principals, and teachers, really sort of figured out and was able to capture like exactly what were their practices, because this district is really interesting. What they did was, over the course of that time period, they continually improved their methods and eventually got to a steady state that really worked to improve equitable identification. And like, just to get to the punchline, like over that time period, they are now identifying 16 times more kids in historically underrepresented groups. 1/6. Okay, that's annual identification rate. That's not sort of an amortized year over year. And so if you look sort of before they did any universal screening, and now that they're doing universal screening, but not just universal screening, actually also using local norms, also being really thoughtful about how they use multiple pathways, also being really thoughtful about how they use combination rules. It turns out OR-based rules are really essential for identifying twice exceptional kids in particular. And so I was able to really sort of unpack that and look at it over time to track how that data changed and what the practices were and how those things changed. And then there's a whole nother side of the study around the attitudes of all the players, the stakeholders at each level, at the teacher level, at the principal level, at the administrator level, on this whole system that had emerged, right? And of course, there were folks who were pro and folks who were con on everything. And what I was able to do was really show both sides of the argument for basically everything. I mean, it's a beautiful little microcosm of what gifted education kind of looks like in practice in so many places, and all the tensions. Like, what are all those tensions that come up? And they come up everywhere. I think they're fairly universal. And so it ended up being quite long. Sorry.
So no. So can you give us a couple examples of these tensions?
One major tension that shows up a lot is around test prep, right? So if you've got, sort of some communities of parents who really are very motivated to get their kids into a program, right? Often these are, more affluent, often more white, often more Asian families. Not always, but there's definitely a skew in that direction, who are willing, interested, and able to prep their kids, right? And there are programs out there. I'm not a big fan, but whatever, it exists, right? And then you've got, on the other side, teachers who are really concerned about kids who are sort of over prepping to get into a program that might not be, in fact, the right fit. But it's complex. It's so complex, right? Because, these teachers now are also getting a whole much wider range of kids into their classrooms identified as highly capable because of the equitable identification practices, right? They're getting more multilingual kids. They're getting more low-income kids. They're also getting a lot more twice exceptional kids. Okay, so a twice exceptional kid that isn't necessarily your quiet, compliant, studious sort, from a teacher lens, might look like a kid who doesn't belong here, right? And they might say, well, was that kid prepped into this classroom? I mean, maybe sometimes, but I actually don't think that's the major issue going on. I think that that kid needs some support, and that teacher wasn't fully supported yet in how to recognize that, how to see that. What kind of support does this kid need? Like, all of our high cap kids are not sort of academic high flyers and sort of independent, right? Independently brilliant. I think is sort of the stereotype that a lot of people have, and, can do all the things, can, follow the directions, do their homework, have the executive function, all those pieces. And like, yeah, we've got a few of those, right? But they're almost, in this larger community, they're almost the unicorns, right? The much larger gifted community are kids who do have all flavors of neurodiversity, right? Our neurospicy kids, right? Sometimes diagnosed, sometimes not diagnosed, right? Where you've got dyslexia and dysgraphia and autism and ADHD and, auditory sensory, vision processing. Like, there's so many things going on, hardly ever that are even fully diagnosed. And so when you really put that in the soup and you're really collecting all these kids who have the potential, yeah, those classrooms are going to look different, right? But it's not because the kids don't belong there, right?
And because you've referenced twice exceptional a couple of times, I was wondering if, one, you could just define that for our listeners, and two, talk a little bit more about some of the identification strategies that you've identified as being particularly helpful for that particular population.
Great question. So a twice exceptional student is a student who is both what we would say in Washington, highly capable, and many other places would say gifted and talented, or TAG, who has some kind of high capacity, high potential, high ability, maybe in a discrete area, maybe sort of globally, and also has some kind of a disability, a learning difference, a neurodiversity, a mental health challenge, something else going on that is going to interrelate, right, with that ability. And so it's twice exceptional is a huge umbrella, right? When you tell me a kid is twice exceptional, I'm like, great, tell me more, because like that doesn't actually give me a whole lot of information, right? You really have to know a lot more about what's really going on to have even a sense as to the profile of that student, right? But it is sort of a helpful umbrella term to be able to say, okay, we have this class of kids who, yeah, they might have some real need and readiness for acceleration or depth in some area, but they need some support at the same time, right? And in order to access that, they're going to need that level of support. And if you don't provide that support, they're never really going to show you what they can do, right?
That's a perfect response. If you don't mind, just expand a little bit more on the identification, particularly, is the most popular methods for identifying gifted students effective for that particular population? And if it isn't, what advice would you have for other schools or school districts or practitioners to be better equipped to think about twice exceptional learners or the potential of twice exceptional learners within their student population?
Well, we can go back to my dissertation, actually, that really one very key insight that came out of that is that they identified way more twice exceptional kids, and they weren't actually intending to. It was sort of a byproduct of the process that they ended up using. There's some really good insights there, because the key piece that really moved the needle for twice exceptional kids was using a form of combination rules called OR-based rules, where instead of saying a kid needs to qualify on this test and that test, you say the kid needs to qualify on this test or that test. Right? And actually, even better if you've got multiple options, right? So a way to think about it is that you're giving the kid multiple chances to demonstrate their readiness or their ability. Okay. Actually, why they did it was purely for cost saving, right? To not have to test a kid multiple times, right? As soon as we have a qualifying score in something, we're done. We're not going to test this kid anymore. We don't need to see it twice, right? But the impact of that was that they gave kids multiple chances, right? And if the kid, after 2 or 3 chances on, the way they had it set up, different instruments depending on grade level, then okay, the kid doesn't qualify. But as soon as the kid had a qualifying score, you're in, we're done, and we're not going to test you anymore. And the impact that had was that it scooped in so many more twice exceptional students, which in retrospect makes perfect sense. Like, it's not even that's not even hard to understand, right? Because our twice exceptional students do have this like wonky up and down profile of test scores. Like that's just what happens with them, right? Sometimes they're in their A game and they can show what they know on this particular instrument. Sometimes because of the kid, because of the environment, because of the test, because of the match, whatever, right? It doesn't go so well. And so when you require a twice exceptional kid to show us that you're working at the 98th percentile here, here, and here, they hardly ever can be that consistent, right? But if you say, no, once we see that you're working at this level here, like we're going to believe that. It comes down to believing high test scores can't happen by accident, which they don't, and not getting all wrapped up in low test scores, right? Thinking that low test scores tell you something, right? Because there's 1,000 reasons why a kid could have a low test score that doesn't mean anything about the kid's ability. Right. And you have to be willing. That's hard for administrators. It's really hard for administrators to look at this kind of profile and to believe the ups, but not the downs.
I want to talk about twice exceptional. So this morning we met with a school here in Seattle, and they talked about how they are a highly capable elementary middle school, and they assess students at the age of 4 with an IQ test, and to assess whether or not they can get into the school. And I'm curious from your perspective, is the IQ test the best way to go in terms of measuring for potential going in at that early age? Are there other methods? Do we lose those students who are twice exceptional in doing tests like IQ tests that early on? What would you recommend to a school like this to really be able to look at a student holistically to measure for their intellectual and creative potential?
So, I mean, IQ tests certainly have their place, right? And when they tell us something, they usually tell us something that's valid and interesting. But they are far from the only way to get good data, right? And there's also real bias issues. There are certain populations for whom we know it's not sort of fully fair, right? It's not fully culturally fair, and for lots of different reasons, language reasons, cultural reasons, et cetera. I am not a fan of using IQ as like the one benchmark, right? I think it's convenient for private schools, but they can also choose to be choosy, right?
Yep.
They can make their own rules. I think when you're thinking about public systems, it's really hard to make an argument that IQ is what public schools should be using. And really, if you go a little bit deeper and understand local norms, right? I think local norms actually really helps us understand how to use things like achievement testing and group-based ability testing much more effectively in the context of public schools, because there is this concern like, okay, well, if we can't use IQ, then we're like stuck with these other tests, right? That we know also have issues, right? Well, yes, that is true. But there are ways that you can interpret those test scores differently. Right. And so let's say, for instance, and, like, again, my dissertation is another case study of this, right, where they said, OK, we're going to have this general criteria of the 95th percentile. Any kid who scores at the 95th percentile in math or reading, we're going to scoop into this program and provide services in either math or reading. OK. But they also said, but for our multilingual learners, our English learners, and for our low income students, we're going to create a different criteria. We're going to say kids can need to score at the 88th percentile or higher. Okay. And so for those particular populations, there was a different criteria. That is a form of local norms. It's a group-based local norm, right? And it's basically correcting for the fact that there is a difference in those groups in their relationship to the instrument, to the test. There's test bias in some tests, right, that are going to affect certain populations differently than others, right? But there's also a difference in what we call opportunity to learn. Right? Have those kids all had the same opportunity to learn what is being assessed on the test? Right? So when you have a lower score of, say, a multilingual student, is that because that kid is not as capable? Or is it because the kid has 2 languages and this is not their primary language, right? And maybe hasn't had all the same academic experiences that a sort of typical kid might have, right? So you use local norms almost as like a corrective factor, right? To make sure that you're looking thoughtfully at, all the things that could be going on with a particular kid. And so when you take that approach, you can use any test. It doesn't matter, right? Use an achievement test, use an ability test, use the Naglieri, use the Kogat, use an Iowa, use a Smarter Balance, use a MAP test. Like, it doesn't matter, right? The kids that are clearly high are going to be clearly high. That wasn't the hard part to begin with. But in these historically underrepresented groups, I think particularly about multilingual and about free and reduced are sort of the really easy ones to think about. But I think we could probably spread a little broader there if we think a little harder, right? In those groups, if you use a local norms approach, you can identify the kids who within that group are going to be sort of the highest performers within, say, the multilingual group, or the highest performers within the free and reduced group. Right. The school district that I studied pulled those kids into a highly accelerated program. They had these kids accelerated 2 to 3 grade levels in math, and they were doing just fine. Like, they even shared some data showing achievement scores of these kids a couple years later, and it was indistinguishable. The kids who were qualified using a local norm versus kids who qualified sort of via the traditional means, 2 years later, they had the same achievement. So it really validates this idea that you really need to adjust how you look at these test scores. It's not that the kids are not as capable, it's that the test is not showing it fully clearly. And so you have to interpret it correctly. And local norms is a tool for how we do that.
Okay, Austina.
Yeah.
I know you've done a lot of parent work and parent outreach with Gifted Ed. So can you tell us, imagine we come to you and we are parents of a child that we think is gifted or twice exceptional. What advice would you give to them if they say, there's just, my child is not fitting in school, my child doesn't enjoy the classroom, and there's no gifted programs in the area? What advice would you give me? Because that's the question we hear a lot.
So I do a lot of that consulting work, actually. I work with families quite often. And I'd say the number one issue is that families don't fully appreciate their kids' twice exceptionality. And they actually don't have all the diagnosis dialed in. They think they know what's going on. Often what they think they know is ADHD. But actually, when you pick it apart and really understand what's underneath there, there's usually a lot more complexity. And I think the useful thing, right, is that when you understand what's really going on with a kid, you have so many more tools to help and so much more understanding as to what's really happening. There's a whole lot of, it's like a dozen that I call the ADHD lookalikes, right? Things that look, smell, and act like ADHD. And even if you go to a neuropsychologist and get a full eval, would probably score as ADHD in most cases, but may or may not actually be a neurotransmitter issue that's going to respond to medication, right? Or maybe, yes, there's that, but there's also other pieces that are, sort of exacerbating each other, right? So things that come up super, super common, vision processing disorders, where the two eyes are actually not working in concert with each other, right? And so if the two eyes are not moving together, that's going to create a whole lot more sort of stamina issues in vision. And we could talk for a long time just about vision, right? So there are vision processing issues. There are auditory processing issues, right, that make it hard. It's basically a timing issue effectively between the two ears, right, where the brain is sort of hearing things imbalanced and the timing is off, right? Again, it makes it really hard to understand in noise. When a kid can't understand well in noise and is really sort of struggling to understand what all these little noises mean, right? Our kids care, right? They all care, right? And they know that they're missing something. And so they hear this little noise and they hear that little noise and they hear that little noise and they're saying, was that important? Was that important? Was that important? Is somebody calling my name? Was that an instruction I needed to listen to? Right? That just makes you hypervigilant, right? That's like a recipe for creating anxiety in a kid, right? And some kids, they become impulsive. They become, sort of dysregulated, right? A lot of the behaviors that we might associate with ADHD look exactly the same, right? I could go on and on, right? Auditory and vision are sort of the two biggies, but there's a whole bunch of other ones, including a whole bunch of medical things that get overlooked, like sleep apnea. Like when kids are not sleeping well at night, that 100% looks exactly like ADHD. 100%. right? It's a medical issue. It needs to get chased down. And so when you understand all these different things that could be going on and you sort of look at it more deeply, to really understand what I think of as like the root causes underneath twice exceptionality, you have so many more tools, right, to actually be able to help. Like if you understand it's an auditory issue, you're not going to be spending a lot more energy thinking about, okay, what is this kid's auditory environment? How can we support that? Is it worth getting some tools? There's a great ear filter that you can get. There are low gain hearing aids that you can get, right? Is it important for this kid to have, some head muffs that they can put on occasionally, right? Or just pay attention to how much auditory chaos they're experiencing over the course of the day. They need quiet time to break. And if you provide those accommodations, those might help 10 times more than anything you would do for executive function issues, right? Because that may not actually be the root problem. So like when I talk with families, 98% of the time, once I hear somebody's story, it's like, oh, well, have you ever looked into this? Have you ever looked into that? That kind of sounds like this. But most families don't even know that those questions can be asked. They don't even know that those are things that exist, that could be supported, that is even in the ether. But we could also talk about gifted education. I mean, yes, in schools, there isn't enough gifted education. And I think there's also a lot of debate around what gifted education actually is. I'm a big fan of, a fundamentally accelerated based approach, right? If you've got a kid who is clearly scoring high in math, there's a limit to how much going deeper and being more enriched is really going to move that kid forward. At some point, you got to move on, right? And so, I think we need to be providing more acceleration in schools, with some good depth and complexity along the way, because you don't want kids sort of racing along. But to actually produce that, to actually make that happen in the context of a public school system, there's a lot of logistics to make that actually possible. Right? That's where it really gets to be hard. But I think when we have school districts that they define their gifted programming as sort of purely enrichment based or purely creativity based, right? You actually get into some really sticky waters, right? Because how do you explain that a kid who is sort of high potential in math, for instance, right? Or high potential in reading or in, sort of verbal skills. Why would that kid need creativity skills any more than any other student in the school? There's a real sort of moral ethical problem there, right? All of our kids deserve enrichment, creativity, flexible thinking skills, brainstorm, all that good stuff, right? It is very hard for me to say, yeah, that's only for our gifted kids. Why? That doesn't make any sense to me. I think all kids everywhere need that. And yet also we have these kids for whom the typical grade level classroom stuff, they've already mastered those standards. They need to move on. And that's largely going to be acceleration.
Austina, I 100% agree with you on that. That's something that I've always been curious about is why is it that we could sell, not that we're selling creativity, but we can advocate for creativity in gifted programs. We can be around educators who are gifted and say, yes, we need creativity. But you go to a standard teacher or a regular school district and they don't seem like they're oh, well, that's for the gifted students. That's for the gifted students. I'm like, okay,
that's
so
for all kids.
It's actually, since I've been here, that's exactly what I've been thinking I understand there's a historical relationship between gifted ed and creativity, but it seems crazy. If you look at how many creativity scholars are here at this conference, but we should be finding ways to infuse creativity throughout the curriculum and also throughout academic events such as this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's a role for creativity everywhere, including in advanced accelerated learning.
Yes.
Right. But it's not like its own domain. I've always pushed back again, why are we having a creativity lesson? That seems kind of goofy to me. It should be imbued in everything else. And it shouldn't be just for the gifted kids.
Yeah.
Right. That. I don't get that.
No.
So you've been using the word highly capable.
Yeah.
I've also, we know, talented and gifted, sometimes gifted education. Could you tell us a little bit about these different names that exist within the field? why you have a particular preference and, any concerns about using one name over another name?
Oh, nomenclature is that is the big hot topic right now. But there's a real good reason why I use the word highly capable, because that is the Washington state word. It's what's built into our Washington state laws. It's actually just before my time, but only just. So I was not there when that was decided, but I actually really support the decision because I think the word gifted carries a lot of baggage that, especially for folks not in the field, doesn't fully make sense. And it sort of creates these negative connotations that I think we fight with in all different places. And so, moving to some different nomenclature, I think is probably healthy. I have found highly capable or high cap to be pretty effective in Washington state. In my mind, it's a very similar concept. Conceptually, it's the same thing. It's not like there's some other hidden meaning in there. It's just a different word. But that said, at the end of the day, you can call it whatever you want. You can call it Philadelphia. It's still a difficult concept for people to wrap their heads around. Right. And so just changing the word doesn't necessarily change everything about it. But I think it does make it a little bit easier to talk about, especially when you get away from this idea that kids are just sort of magically gifted this, this amazing gift. And actually, like, when you really understand our field, it's not a gift in all cases, in a lot of cases. Even for a kid who is kind of that unicorn and can, do a lot of things, there's still some heaviness that comes with that. Right. And just the being different in a world where that is not typical is heaviness. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think a different word is helpful. Is it the perfect word? I don't know, but I think it's a step perhaps in the right direction.
And we've really gravitated toward the, Mark Runco talking about creative potential, but the idea of potential, I like highly capable because it speaks to a capability. And the need to support someone maximizing their potential with that capability. Whereas, as you referenced, the idea of being gifted something, it's like, oh, they're gifted on the piano, right? Like they've got this gift, they're gifted at soccer. I think I'm going to shift over to highly capable.
I like that much more too. And I haven't heard that term until today when we were at the school.
Because we're East Coast.
Well, welcome to Washington. I like highly capable because it gets across both the idea that a kid could be high capacity and really achieving at that level. Yeah. But it also gets that potential idea in there also. You could be highly capable and maybe not achieving there yet, but you're capable of it. Yes. Right. And so it gets both aspects, which I think is important, right? We need to have both sides of that to really do a good job.
Austina, this has been such an incredible conversation. And for those of you listening, teachers and parents and administrators and emerging scholars, which is our target audience, we will send them the link to your website so they can learn more about your work, because I think there's a lot to dig into. Now, before we go, we want to ask you a question. It's a new question on our podcast that we're going to start asking all of our interviewees. And the question is, can you share with us a creative educational experience that you've had in your life, either formal or informal, and the impact that it's had on you?
Well, I think it's an educational experience that I built, and actually in my first career. So one of the things that I did in my first career was I built a training program for Microsoft engineers to teach them how to be more customer focused, how to sort of take the ideas of design thinking and really build them into engineering. So, the biggest problem in engineering teams is that they end up building a beautiful solution to the wrong problem, right? I mean, that, to just put it simply, like that's the issue, right? And so that was a real problem that needed to be solved. And so the way that we did it kind of broke all the norms, right? What we did was we brought entire teams into a training room together. We would have them in the same room together for a day or sometimes two. We would bring in their live customers to do live customer interviews and have them like eye to eye with their customer. We would work their problem over the course of the day in a facilitated way where it was real workshop. We would tell them how to do it, but then it was like, okay, and here's your customer, and now you really think through. And by the end of that day or the end of the 2-day sessions, we had 2 different flavors of workshops. They often had created new product ideas that they were going to go to market with a year later. So that was really fun to innovate and to do, especially an adult education thing that really got everybody engaged and not just their eyes glazing over, because they were really doing the work and doing their real work, their day job, right? But just in a facilitated way where they're learning a bunch of tools along the way.
Fun.
Well, thank you so much. We're really grateful for your time. And if you're listening to the show, remember this is part of our series, opening up season 10. We're going to be putting all these conversations together on our website. You can visit that at fuelingcreativitypodcast.com. My name is Dr. Matthew Worwood.
And my name is Dr. Cyndi Burnett.